So am I live? Okay. So welcome to this session on open source, GitHub, and BlackBerry world. Just so I have an idea, because I'm planning to do some slides and then also intermix some live demos on GitHub. How many of you are using GitHub on a regular basis? Okay, so sounds like maybe half of you. How many people have not used GitHub at all? Okay, so we'll do a bit of that, and we'll see how it works on that one. All right. So what I wanted to do is to give you a bit of motivation here for what we're going to be trying to do. So let's see where I can actually make this thing work. Where's my mouse? Do I have a mouse? Here. All right, so that should be switching to, there it goes. Okay, so say that you start on the samples app here, right? And you're trying to do some development. So the main entry point for us is the developer of the BlackBerry.com that got just redone recently. And then from there, you can go to whatever is your platform. And then all of our platforms have several tabs, one of which is the samples. So if you go to the samples tab, then you get this large collection of samples. It varies depending on the platform, right, on the technology, right? And you can scroll up and down and all of that. Now, ultimately, what we want is to be able to automatically generate some of these things from GitHub. But our policy for the last year and a half or so has been that all the samples are at GitHub with an open source license. So if you go to any of the samples, you should be able to go and then click one of these. So for example, in this case, it shows you this pop-up, right? There's a description. And then from here, you can go to one of two places. You can go to either browse on GitHub, right? And that would show you the GitHub. Oh, and I forgot. I need a connection. Very sorry. Do we have an internet connection cable here I can connect to? Any of them?
Yeah.
And hopefully this will reload eventually. There it goes. So that's our GitHub repo for that particular sample. So it's linking down into the sample, and if you can see it there, right? So the structure of a repository is going to be, the way you read this thing is, this is in the Cascade Samples repository of the BlackBerry organization. So everything, all of our main repos are in this organization. And then you have the code that you can browse through, okay? But for casual use, you don't need to do it that way. You can just download the source code, right? So if you were to download the source code, this is a particularly large one. So you would get a zip file. That's the photo bomber. That was Johan Larsby's. And then if you extract that zip file, now you get the same sort that I showed you, but it came as a zip, right? So what we want is to automatically create this, all of that infrastructure. But the protocol that we have internally is every time that we update a sample, it's actually updated directly in here, okay? Now, if you look at this is the structure that you can use in your IDE, et cetera. But there are some things in here that are specific about open source, right? So there is a license file. Let's see. I don't know, something like that. There is, so that's the license file. In this particular license is an Apache 2 license. So we'll talk a bit about what that means. There is also a notice file in here. And that is also, it describes what the sample's about and what's the copyright. So I'm going to tell you what does it mean that there is a notice file in there in combination with the Apache 2 license, right? And then you have the rest is the assets, the images, and then here there is the source. If you go here and then look at this source, then you'll see that at the top there is, can you actually read that thing from the back? Yeah. So there is a header file. The header file says that the copyright is Research in Motion, and then it's licensed under the Apache 2 license, right? So what I want to tell you a bit is about what that means, and then how the rest of our processes for creating this thing is, and how do you interact with us as far as if you want to do a change to these files and then submit them back to us, and that whole story. Okay, so that's the context. Let's see, and my bad on the structure of this thing. Okay, so we're done with this. Let's go back to the slides. So that's what we went through. Something else that I didn't tell you, but we'll go back to that one later, is there are a lot of samples. I mean, as of yesterday, I think that the last count is 395 or something like that, right? So we're going to cross 400 as soon as we get back to work and everybody starts pushing the last things. So how do you find this thing? So we have the per technology directories I show you. But those are only our official samples. There are also samples that are coming from the community. So we have a couple of catalogs that are community catalogs that mostly I maintain, but with the help of all the developers. And they are open for anybody to actually add their open source samples to that catalog. And it's not as nice as the official catalog, but it's more complete. And you can also browse through it, and et cetera. So I'll tell you a bit about that one. Okay, so what I want to do is to do a pass on what we're doing open source, emphasize what we're particularly we are doing, talk a bit about the relationship between all of this in BlackBerry world, because there are some legal relationships. So for example, one of the messages you should take home is don't mix GPL v3 with any of code that you're going to push into our app world. And I'll tell you briefly about that one. And then I'm going to encourage you to participate in the community. So very brief overview about introduction to myself. I'm the Senior Director for Open Source. I joined in December 2010. Before that, I used to be at Sun and Oracle and a few other places. And I have multiple hats. So one of my hats is I have a very small group that does the open source compliance. So we are the ones who manage our use of open source, which is very, very extensive. And mostly I personally focus on the outbound. So what I'm doing now here is the not outbound in the sense of giving talks, but more in we have code that we want to push out. When I joined the company, we hadn't pushed code out. We had one project that had just been announced, WebWorks. And as you'll see, by now we have I think it's 82 repositories. And in my spare time, I also manage the GitHub repos and do more tweeting that I should be doing. And I should be doing more blogging, but I haven't been able to. So I'm going to do that. And a big disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer. So anything I say here is not legal advice. I need to say that, and I really mean it. I think I understand these topics, but when there is something tricky comes, I always talk with our lawyer, and you should talk with yours. All right. And then we're going to have two guests, if I'm not too bad and I stick to my schedule roughly. They're going to talk a bit about a couple of open source projects. Because one of the things that happens with open source is there's a lot of activity. And now that we are shipping actually the devices, we have existing projects and we're beginning to see new projects. So I want them to talk a bit about what they are doing. The projects are, one is around Python and the other one is about Mono. So let's talk a bit about what's open source. So essentially, the core of open source is the license, and there are two groups that define what an open source license is. The Open Source Initiative and the Free Software Foundation. Mostly, there are way too many open source licenses, right? There's a small group that is used all the time, and now it sounds like we're settling on a smaller set. But at the beginning, every project had their own slightly different version. So these two communities have, these two organizations have a list of licenses that they describe as being open source. We, for the most, I think in all of our projects, we use like 3 or 4 licenses. We'll talk a bit about those. And they are all approved by open source groups. The reality is that in addition to the legal part, there are dynamics around what is the copyright of the code, and that the relevance of that depends on the license. In some cases, the copyright owner is not that important. In some cases, the copyright owner is more important. There are issues about the governance, which is how code makes into the code base. I'll describe to you how we manage our repositories. It's relatively open with one caveat I'll mention about the contribution agreement. And then in some cases, there are also issues about trademarks, right? So there have been some notable and very visible situations where a project changed ownership in some sense, like Hudson and Jenkins was one that I was personally involved with. And there was a whole copyright issue around, a trademark issue around that caused the change of the name. And there are many participants in open source. There are some major foundations. The presence of GitHub is changing the dynamics of in open source. So it's much easier to fork and just go on your own, and it's also much easier to participate. We're not going to have too much time to talk about some of these things, but after the session is the lunchtime, and I'm going to be in the Ask the Experts. So anything that you want to continue the conversation, we can do that. Okay. So talking briefly about the licenses and the ones that we're going to encounter. So this is the most visible, the most frequent licenses. So there is a whole set that are the BSD family, and so that's the Berkeley System Distribution. And it's very similar to the MIT license and to the zlib licenses. For the most part, you don't have to worry too much about what's the difference between all of these families, the BSD and the MIT zlib. They are very permissive. Essentially, the only thing that you have to do with code under those licenses is you have to include the license, right? I mean, no legal advice, there are small details, but for the most part, is not complicated to deal with those. There is one variant, which is the clear BSD, that explicitly precludes patent grants. Because one of the issues that's happening, especially in the last few years, as you have seen companies talking about patents and situations like that, is whether with open source there is patent that is implied patent grant or explicit patent grants, right? So if you use my code and I have a patent on that code, what does that mean, right? And the clear BSD says we're explicitly not granting you patents through this open source. Apache 2, on the other hand, explicitly grants you patents. So for the most part, we use Apache 2 because we're giving you samples. We want you not to worry about whether there is a patent that's covering that code or what have you. So that's the same license that the Apache Foundation has been using for the last, I don't know, 8 years or 10 years. And that's the one we have been using. It's quite common in some communities. It's very clean. There is this one issue about one requirement about the notice file that I'll mention to you, but otherwise is quite easy to comply with the requirements. And it has that explicit patent grant. Then there is a family of copyleft licenses that they have been evolving. So there are the GPLs, that cover the complete encompass of the program, if you wish. And then there are the LGPLs, sometimes called lesser GPLs, or the library GPLs, which are for components. And we use some LGPL. There are a number of components that we have been using. The additional constraint that exists on the GPLs and LGPLs relative to the permissive license is if you do modifications to the code and you publish the code, the resulting binary, you have to also include the source. We'll talk briefly about that one. The LGPL v3s is the new version of GPL, and it has been around for a while. The problem from our perspective from GPL v3 is that it has a clause about installation instructions. So in addition to the vendor being required to give you the code, the vendor that's giving you the application. So this is a requirement on or a right of the end user, right? So if you buy something from the store and that something has an LGPL v3 component, you're entitled to the code for that LGPL v3 component, but there are also requirements on being able to install that code and create a new application, right? And if you, as you probably know about how the stores are put together, they are all based on code signing, right? So you have to take the sources, you build the whole thing, that's not problematic, but now you have to sign it. To sign it, you need the code signing from us, and you need the keys from us, right? And we give them to you for free, but you have to actually click through and agree to our terms and conditions, which we think are not onerous, but there are some terms and conditions, right? So I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is that we cannot put those constraints, additional constraints, and be compatible with the requirements of GPL v3. So GPL v3 would like all of that to be available to you without any additional click-throughs. So don't put v3s on the store. There might be ways to go around this mechanically. I believe that Simon Phibbs was hosting a presentation or a discussion last weekend on this and FOSDEM. So it's beginning to show up, but it has been the reason why some applications have actually been removed from the Apple App Store, and so there's history on this thing. But luckily, for the most part, all we are dealing with are either the permissive licenses or the GPL v2s, which we can address. Okay? So how are we doing on time? All right, so here is an example very quickly on the open source, how it shows on App World. So this is actually Angry Birds. This is the version from the playbook. The same story should be on the version on the BB10. So when you go to the store, you download Angry Birds. And then Angry Birds, as you start running it, you can actually go to the more information, right? And then from the information, you can get the credits. And if you go through the credits, then you're going to see at the end that it says that the physics is powered by Box2D, which is an open source physics engine. Okay? And then it says in there that the open source licensing information is actually on the website. Then you go follow that link, and you're going to find the website in there that is a very plain expansion and contraction site. And then for each one of the main components in there, it's going to tell you what are the copyright. So the one that's shown out there is Box2D, which is the biggest one, right? I mean, essentially, Angry Birds wouldn't exist without Box2D, right? But there are a few other ones. And then from there, it tells you where the sources are, and I forget what, I think it's the license in there that links to. Yes, sir?
So it's not required to include the text into the app.
Okay, so the question is whether the text has to be included on the application. So here's the problem that we all encounter with the licenses. The licenses are very old. They were designed in the old days when you actually shipped physical media, right? So they talk about including, and in the time that was written, you gave somebody a box that had actually a CD, and then the expectation was that in there would be another piece of paper that had the license, right? So what does it mean to include? And there is no case record on these things, so different people will have different interpretations. The way we would prefer to do it is you bundle the license inside the binary, and then from the about box, when you click on there for that information, is not going to the website, but it's actually included inside the application, and there's the license. But certainly we don't expect, it's not practical to include the source in your distribution. So almost, I don't know anybody that actually does it that way. I mean, everybody points to somewhere outside.
Yeah, we have the whole license somewhere.
Sorry, you have what?
We have the license completely. You can read them.
Yeah, so it's quite common to have the license included in your binary distribution, and that's the way we do it too, right? So I think that that's the best practice, and that's actually one of the things I have on one slide there. Okay, so that's how this works, right? I mean, it's very important for Angry Birds to actually do it that way. All right, so very, very quickly here, we're doing a number of different things at GitHub. We use a lot of code, and we're participating in a number of key communities. The most notables are Qt, WebKit, and Apache. And in these communities, we're participating on a daily basis. I mean, we're just as any other open source contributor in there. In particular, WebKit, our browser is very, very close to the trunk of WebKit. That's why the performance is as good as it is. But most of our daily activity, so most of what you are going to be involved in, is at GitHub. So what I wanted to do is to try to show you a bit about GitHub without eating too much into the time. And we'll see how that works. Okay, where did I go now? Here. I think I have to exit. Oh, I see I have an extra screen here. Okay, so let's go to, where is the one I wanted to show? Okay, so this is GitHub. So GitHub is, at this point, the most popular SourceForge. And it's all based on Git. Git is kind of a bit cryptic, or quite a bit cryptic. You can do quite a bit with GitHub. If you start getting into complicated things, you need to learn more about Git. What most people do is they learn a few recipes. But GitHub has been trying to make it easier and easier to use Git. They, for example, have helped this website called Git.cm that is the main repo for the main website for Git. And there is a fair amount of documentation online. Mostly you'll learn, in my experience, a few recipes, and you'll know how to do that one. And whenever you stay out of that one, then you'll have to walk carefully and maybe get some help, right? But the Git itself is actually in pretty good shape. So let's see, how do we go about this thing? So we have a microsite that is our home at GitHub. And there it is, right? So if you go to the website called BlackBerry.github.com, that shows you our community landing page inside GitHub.com, right? So GitHub.com provides for, it's all based about repositories, right? Everything is a Git repository, right? And then some repositories have two views. There is the user-friendly, if you wish, and then there is a code, raw code view. So GitHub, the BlackBerry.github.com is actually backed by a Git repository, which you probably are not going to interact with. But this is our main microsite. And then from here, there are things like a list, a catalog of repositories, a catalog of samples, a catalog of components that is still a work in progress. And then there is a list of signatories, and there is a geomap that I'll show you. So the organization, the list of all the repos is on the other side. So as I said, BlackBerry or GitHub.com is kind of the pretty, although it's not totally pretty. GitHub.com/BlackBerry is the raw. And as you can see here, we have 81 repos. And we have, the number of members is based on teams, so the number is not terribly accurate. But this is a list of all the repositories, and you can navigate up and down through this, and this is sorted by latest change. But if you go to, say, the Cascade Samples repository, now in here, you have your typical, so all of the GitHub repos look like this, right? And you have multiple ways of getting at data from here. So this is the sources. And if you go, say, to Play Speaker, which is one of the samples down here, right? Now you're going to see the sources for Play Speaker. And you can actually keep navigating down and see the actual source and see it as a source. You can even edit some of these things depending on your permissions. Now, as I said, each repo has two views, and our hope is to actually do that consistently, but for Cascade Samples, we do have that. So the other side is actually the documentation for the sources, right? So remember I told you that there are two different URLs. So this is the URL to access the friendly view of the sources. And then in this one, so this is the Play Speaker is down here, and in here you see the documentation for the Play Speaker. So ultimately, what we want to do is to have this for all the samples. Right now, it's uneven, right? So we're kind of your typical open source organization, which is there's a big emphasis on work in progress, right? So we are continuing working on these things, but that's the basic structure. Okay. Now, for the sake of managing the time, I'm not going to go into more details about GitHub on this one, except to point to you, for example. So here is the structure of how code goes back into GitHub. Let's do it like this. So the GitHub repositories are organized as, they have a hierarchy of a repo that's related to another repo, right? And that is the forking relationship. So whenever somebody wants to add code to, say, BlackBerry Cascade Samples, they can fork the code, and now they can work on that fork. So that's their own version of the repository. And then later, if they want, they can modify their code, and then they can send a request to us to actually accept that code, right? So if you go down here, you'll find, let's say, Eka's repository. And here is his own version, right? So any of you can get to GitHub, get an account, and then do a fork. And that will give you your own version of that code repository. On the other hand, once you have a repository, now you can send requests to us to accept your changes. And the requests show here as in this list, and there are open requests and closed requests. So in the case of Cascade Samples, there are 58 requests that came in, and most of them are actually from RIM employees. But any of you can actually submit a pull request. Okay? So that's the nice thing about GitHub, is that it's very friendly to participation, casual participation. On top of this, we put our own processes for validating that the code actually makes sense, et cetera, et cetera. But if you want to start playing with it, you just fork a repo, start working with it. And if you eventually find a bug or something like that, then you can back to us. You can create an issue that's available in there, right? If you find the fix to the bug, you can actually submit it to us if you want. Okay. All right. So let's see. I think that's the structure on there. Now let me see what else I wanted to cover here. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to tell you here, because we have a lot of code, is how to discover the samples that we have in there. So we have this, I mentioned to you that we have several catalogs. This is the list of all the samples. So there are 394 samples. And you can navigate here. They are organized by technology, right? So you can go and find all the native samples. That includes the BB10s. You can sort it by whether there are cascades or not in here. And then you can go up and down. The other thing that I found useful is to tag the samples. So if you want to find all the samples that are, say, file picker, there's only one that has been tagged file picker. Box2D, there is one. But the most common one, like for example, the cascades, there are 143, right? NFC, there are 18. And as you select the tag, then you get here the list. So all of this is work in progress, right? But our goal with these catalogs is to help you discover what the samples are, because they keep changing. And then we also have a catalog for the repositories, same thing. And at some point, we're going to have the one for the components, which is still in there. Okay, so I think that I gave you a bit of the overview on this. We go into, I think I'm going to exit that. And then I'm going to tell you a bit about all right, so I think what we can do talk now is about the licenses and the requirements. So the key, we talked a bit this at the beginning, but this will be a good moment to repeat and then see where you have have questions. So the key components here are the different licenses the applications are going to show on the app world. The UL is the end user license agreement that has to be shown whenever you start using an application. Then many applications also require privacy statements. We haven't started doing too much of that one, but in general it's a good idea. And then the source and the credits. So if you have a BSD license, essentially the only thing that you have to do is you have to include the license. Right? So BSD is MIT, is zips. The zlib, sorry, that says zip, but it's zlib license. The requirement is to include the license, and that's pretty much it, right? It's a good practice to always give credit where you got the code from, etc., but it's not actually required, right? And then by including is a conversation, the point I made before, which is what does include mean? The best practice is to actually include it on your binary, and the best practice is to do self-documented, self-compliant application, so you can go to the about box and then have it in there. That's the best way of doing this thing. Apache 2 is similar. The only difference is that the notice file, if there is a notice file in the code, you are required to include it. So that's the only thing that Apache 2 requires you to do in addition to the BSD type of license. Okay? And that's normally used to put in the notice file the copyright and we're in the credits. We probably are overusing notices, and we're doing too many notices, but that's the way we started doing it. So at some point we'll have to do another pass and try to decide whether we really care about putting the credits in there, because you're supposed to keep it as it moves forward. Yes, sir?
So I assume
Yes, you can add to the notice. Yeah, yeah. And it's quite common to actually add more credits in there, right? And as you modify your code, you can just keep adding stuff in there, right? Yeah, yeah. Okay. So the reason why we're giving you the Apache 2 is because it was very popular. It's very popular in some circles, and the patent grants, and we didn't want to have any doubts that we were actually giving you the code to use. The LGPL is in the GPLs. There is the issue about the license. There is the question about the source, which was the discussion I made about what does it mean to be included. And then the part about documentation is a comment I made about self-documented. So here's one example from the browser. So our browser, this is actually from the BlackBerry 10 browser. Okay. So if you go to the browser and go to settings and look on about, actually you can go and look at your BB10, you'll see that the about has that acknowledgments, and that's actually a very long file that's included in the application, right? And it starts by saying, well, we include some code, there's open source. You keep going through that one, you'll see all the contributors and all of that. And then if you go to our website, to GitHub, you'll find that the WebKit BB10 repo is there, and that has the snapshots for the WebKit that we're using in our browsers. Right, so this was updated just yesterday with the code for our released version. Okay, so that's actually a very good practice, right? There has this discussion about where the code is included, but in reality, we own the copyright owners. We're the only ones who can have a discussion about that one, and we think that that's very fair. Okay. And then the comment that I made about the v3 is in there. So as far as the community, and I think that's okay. So I'm okay on the time. The situation right now with our open source community is that it's growing very nicely, especially now that the devices are beginning to be real. So what we have been trying to do is to encourage participation from all the members of the community. So this is a geomap that I put together, and I'm going to show you the real one. Sorry. So this is the live geomap. And there is a vanity URL for it. So if you go to, the way to remember is blackberry.github.com/geomap. All right. So that shows you all of the individuals that have signed our contribution agreement. And I'll tell you about that in just a second. There's always this problem with Google Maps about how they search. But we're beginning to have contributions from around the world, right? So I think that we're at 76 or something like that. And when we have somebody that wants to contribute code to us, what we do is we ask them to sign this contribution agreement. And the contribution agreement is, I should have got it here. Okay, so here is the ICLA, and it's going to go and get it as a well, here it is. Right? So this is the same contribution agreement that Apache is using. I mean, we just mutated it slightly. Our lawyers insisted on asking about whether the contributor is more than 18 years old. And the thing about contribution agreements is there are two mechanisms. There is the old, well, I think that most people have switched to this mechanism, which is you keep your copyright. You don't give us the copyright, it's yours. But you grant us the ability to use it. So you give us essentially a license. Okay? So it's the same one that Apache is using. It's very similar to the one that Eclipse is using. It means that we can take the code and we can use it any way we want. Right? So when people want to contribute, then I ask them to sign this thing, and as they sign, then I add them to this list. And when they do that, I also ask them if they mind being also in the geomap. So that's how our geomap is looking like now. And we're beginning to have people from Australia, some people from Southeast Asia. The majority of the contributions are still coming from North America and Europe. But I very much welcome you to participate. I modified the map a bit to also show people who are contributing in other ways. At this point, it's only showing the contribution agreements. So any questions on that part? Because sometimes there's confusion about the contribution agreement, right? So you're not giving us your copyright, it's still your copyright. So the majority of the contributions are coming through samples and bug fixes, but then there are a few contributions that are to the community at large that I think are worth pointing out. So what I wanted to do is to give Peter and Rob an opportunity to talk and present what they are doing. Before I go there, the slides are going to be available, and there are more opportunities for contribution. Like always, there's a lot of work to do. There are some things that actually are hard for us to do. So if you ever wonder why the Wikipedia pages that are related to BlackBerry 10 sometimes have obvious mistakes, we're not allowed to change those. So we need your help to actually get them right. Right? I mean, I actually maintain somewhere an issue list that has all the errors as I encounter them, but there is a rule that that Wikipedia uses about conflict of interest that seems to apply to us, and we certainly don't want to do that. Okay, so what I think I would like to do is to now switch so that you guys, Peter and Rob, can talk about their projects. And so what we have is, I forgot to mention about this one. So this is a project that you'll mention it just because it's the slide there, is generating cascades front end to a Haskell backend that runs also on the device. So that's a kind of dynamic that happens in a healthy ecosystem with open source. So this is a community that they understand how to do. Actually, this is a commercial company. They understand how to do Haskell. Cascades gives a very nice front end, I mean the UI. So that's what they are working on, and these things are beginning to show up in the store. All right. So another one that's actually is just yesterday, one of the lead developers for Ruby was talking about porting Ruby to BlackBerry 10, right? So I think that what I would like to do now is to talk briefly about, give Peter an opportunity to talk about Python, and then we'll talk a bit about the monoport. And then the remaining time we'll do Q&A, and then we'll do follow-up afterwards. Okay?
Hello. My name is Peter Hansen. I'm the president of Ingenuity Corporation, which these days is me. But I've been in business since 1993, doing an awful lot of stuff in embedded systems, machine control, instrumentation, that kind of stuff. And for the last 12 or so years, it's almost all been Python with the odd bit of C when performance is absolutely critical. And so I've got something I'm going to use to guide myself here, just to make sure I'm not going for too long. Python, if you're unfamiliar with it, is a dynamically typed, strongly typed language that puts it in the class of JavaScript and Perl in the sense of being dynamic, but definitely not in the class of JavaScript in terms of being strongly typed, because it's more like C++ in that you can't add a string and a number and have the string magically converted to a number just to make them go together the way it works in JavaScript. Python has been around since about 91. It has been following a bit of an exponential curve in popularity, and in recent years it's been used in an awful lot of places, including some very big names. Google, if you weren't familiar with it, the original web crawler stuff that Google did was all Python. So sucking in all those pages was Python. Chewing it all up and serving up the web stuff, of course, is C++ servers and much faster stuff. Dropbox is another familiar name. They use Python for just about everything, including the UI client that goes on your desktop machine. It's also widely used in scientific projects. JPL and NASA and a lot of interesting places like that use it. So that's actually probably why we've been using it in the scientific stuff that we've been doing, robotics and whatnot. The project in this case is probably going through name changes still, because it started off as BBX Python. It has now become BBPy project, and I wouldn't be surprised with RIM's name change that they're going to protect that BB thing at the beginning a little bit more aggressively. So I suspect this year it'll be Python for BlackBerry or something like that. But it'll always be at the same place, easy to find, so don't worry about the name. I started about a year ago, shortly after we got the beta 2.0 for the playbook, and discovered that there was a Python 3.2 instance running in there, which also, if you didn't know, is handling kind of all the behind-the-scenes stuff of the PIM, getting your Twitter and Facebook feeds and your contacts and your email and sticking it all in a SQLite database and chewing around with it, all that kind of stuff. The interesting parts are Python. The UI layer, of course, is not. It's all, I think, Cascades now, although nobody ever wants to really confirm those things. There's actually a second copy of Python in the device, 2.7 version, locked down, secure, used for all the installation stuff. Don't need to go into that because it's completely inaccessible to us. 3.2, however, has very generously been left totally accessible, but completely unsupported. So this is a community-run project to try to take advantage of that. Even though there's no promise from RIM right now that it will necessarily stick on the platform. But there's a lot of promise there and potential, and it's a whole other discussion to get into about some of those details. There's two main thrusts for the project right now. One is to port PySide. PySide is a variant of something called PyQt or PyQt. Which was under an LGPL license, or actually a GPL license. And so I think it was Nokia that pretty much started up PySide to try to recreate a whole set of APIs fairly compatible, which wraps all the Qt C++ classes using Python. There's some very complicated technical details to make that work, but practically speaking, it means if you're a Python programmer, you can pretty much write code that would look an awful lot like what the C++ code would look like, but you're writing it all in Python, calling the same classes, all very dynamic. There's actually advantages, disadvantages, always trade-offs with these things. So PySide, I believe, is still part of the Qt project officially, but I don't really know the status in terms of what Digi is doing with it now that they've bought the whole thing from Nokia. PySide traditionally is just Qt, but Mike Prog, who I think is from the Czech Republic, has ported it to, he's added Cascade support. So basically he now can do Cascades UI. He's doing it in QML for the UI stuff mainly, but I don't believe that's a limitation. I think you can do it all in Python procedural code, the same way you could do a UI completely in C++ without touching QML. In the summer, Kshitij Ritesh Patel and I worked on porting PySide initially to the playbook, and I was displeased with some of the trade-offs that we had then. At the time, because on the playbook there was no Qt instance. I switched between Qt and Qt. Bear with me on that. There was no instance of that on the playbook, so we had to bundle not only all the Qt libraries, but also all the PySide libraries, which meant that a Hello World app was on the order of, I think, 28 megabytes, something like that. It would also take about 8 seconds to load on Python on the playbook. Obviously, things are much improved on the Z10. I think the same stuff would take only about 4 seconds to load. And it's down to, I think he's got it down to close to on the order of 10 or 12 megabytes for pure PySide stuff. And if you're doing cascades, then actually, I guess they're on par because all the Qt libraries are included on the platform now. So you're just adding the PySide libraries, but they're still substantial. I think minimum 4 megabytes for just getting a sort of a hello world off the ground. The alternative path, which I went to when we got beta 3, I think, on the dev alphas, was a from the ground up attempt at a whole new approach, and it's called BB Tart because Tart is kind of like a lighter weight pie, and it uses a very small C++ stub launcher, so it actually launches as a QNX/ELF entry point, which means it's basically a Cascades app, and very quickly it starts up a Python interpreter in a secondary thread, starts up the Qt application, and our approach is to focus on QML for the UI, so it's always a QML UI that's loaded. And then there's a bidirectional asynchronous message passing mechanism, currently using JSON messages, but there's no reason, in fact, that's transparent, so there's no reason we have to stick with the performance problems of, well, I shouldn't call it a problem. It's quite fast, but we can improve on that. And so you end up with a QML app with behavioral stuff for the UI written in JavaScript, sending messages through this channel to a Python thread in the back end, which can itself spawn multiple threads to do all kinds of interesting stuff if you need it to. And any of those can be sending messages back up to the UI through a separate channel. And then the UI can do interesting stuff with it. So I've actually been writing all my stuff using BB Tart now. So has Kshitij Patel, and there's 2 or 3 other people. I haven't got all the names right in my head, but I'll do a quick demo at the end just so that we can switch over to the HDMI because I may not have the microphone then, showing a couple of the different things. How am I for time?
I think that if you can do the demo, then we can.
Okay, give me 60 seconds. I'll zoom through. In terms of support, at the moment, we haven't found any real limits of what we can do. We've actually wrapped NFC, BBM, all the BPS stuff, which means Navigator, Live Screen, Locale, Virtual Keyboard, PCM audio stuff, OpenGL, and that's what I'll try and show you with the Battery Guru port to Playbook. And anything you can do in the Python, with Python using all the many, it's got a huge third-party set of libraries available, all open source stuff. And that's about it, I guess. We've got, I assume it's all up there. Twitter, don't see the Twitter project, it's not there. BB Pi project, all one word. You can follow on Twitter. There's about 160 people following now, and that's with only 120 tweets. I consider that not too bad. The root URL, you can actually go to blackberry-pi.microcode.ca, or you can go to that one. But there's a kind of umbrella site to direct to all the other stuff. I don't know if we can get that up, but you can find it on the Twitter page. Okay, so Eduardo will update that with the main one. That's enough. I don't want to take too much of your time. So let's just see if we can get the HDMI switched over to this guy. So basically that's Python code driving OpenGL directly in the back end. Oh, thank you. The UI itself on this one is QML. So I've got the sort of stuff that you'd be able to do trivially. There's really nothing about it there that's related to Python, but all the messages to get all this stuff going are going to the back end. When I touch on this, it's an on-touch handler on a foreign window control in Cascades, blasting little tiny JSON messages down to Python, which is driving the OpenGL stuff directly. So kind of a good demonstration, I think. I mean, performance is pretty good. I have to implement my own kinetic scrolling, so it doesn't keep scrolling when I release, but that's just code. So there you go. I think that's it.
Yep. So from my side, the interesting here is that this is done, we're not engaged at all at RIM, right? So that's a typical open source arrangement. So if you want to be doing Python on BlackBerry 10, you can do it. Right. So here's another large community. Oh, you have it there.
Hi. So when Eduardo asked me to do a quick demo, I thought I'd just hijack his presentation, and I wrote a small program to actually show you what I've been done with my project Monoberry actually on the device. So I've written this program called Lightning Talk, which I just used to do a quick presentation using my Bluetooth remote. So Monoberry, my name's Rob Lilac. I'm a big fan of motorbikes, and I don't have a real logo for Monoberry, so that's why I'm just putting in some motorbike photos there. In the next 5 minutes, I want to talk to you about what is it, why bother, what actually is working with Monoberry, where can I get it, and how can I help? So what is it? Monoberry actually is Mono on the BlackBerry 10 platform. So if you don't know Mono, it's an open source, multi-platform, multi-language implementation of what Microsoft calls .NET. And Mono for BlackBerry isn't just like taking Mono and putting it on the device. It's actually filled with some small patches for getting it running on the QNX system. There's some API wrappers to actually use this native API that we get on the system. And there's a whole bunch of tools for packaging and deployment stuff to the devices. And with all of this, you can use every language that you may know from the .NET framework, like C#, F#, or PHP, whereas a compiler available, Python, whatever you like, and you can use it on the BlackBerry, and you can really natively access any of those APIs that you know from the C libraries. And it's not like the Android runtime, which is like an alien that's put on top of the system. So it's really, nothing is emulated. It's real native access. Why bother? So like only 10% of the most popular languages right now, this is a pretty recent study, is C++. So there's so many developers out there that are using other languages. Why should we force ourselves to use C++ just to get stuff running on the mobile? So there are so many ways to express better than with C. So just look at this simple example. I think you all understand what's going on here. It's just an Hello World app opening an alert dialog with 3 buttons, and one of those buttons just plays a sound. It's really easy to get there. You get this code completion stuff from your C# IDE, and it's really easy to get stuff running on the system. Apart from this, if you want to drag in some third-party libraries, you don't need to like cross-compile native stuff to get it running on the device. You just can use the DLL that you got somewhere, and it's just magically working because it's all packaged up as an application. And you don't have to go that way. Like cross-compiling is really like you're losing the ground under your wheels or something. It's not something that you want to do each day. Another big point is just that you can share code for different like legacy platforms. So you can write your UI code for each of the platforms and share the backend code in C# or any other language that you have with different devices. Okay, what works, what doesn't? Actually, most stuff doesn't work right now. This is, you can see it's all that basic windowing stuff that is working right now, and there's a big catch to it. There's one thing missing, and that's cascades. So right now, we don't have cascade support, but probably we will get there sometime. Where can I get it? Just take a quick photo of this QR code, or like use the URL, and how can I help? Of course you can. It's all on GitHub. It's all MIT X11 licensed, and I'm very happy to have you helping me getting this thing done. Thanks.
So that's all I had. Let's see, the switch is on. Oops. Right. And we're out of time, but can we do like, I don't think that there's a session after this. Can we do 5 minutes of Q&A or? Sorry? Yeah. Yep. Okay. So, I mean, this is a good example of, the last two are very good examples of the power of open source as a community, because these are not efforts that we have the resources to actually engage in. But because we're a very open platform, we are very happy to encourage them to actually participate on this thing. And anything in this space, we are very happy to see it happen. And we'll provide support as we can. We don't have the headcount to actually do it. Right? So any questions that you may have, anything that I can answer, on, both on the specifics and on the general direction? I mean, as you can see, our policy right now is we are pushing everything to open source. We open source the Python. Well, we pushed out the changes to the Python, the port. Yeah.
What are the parts we can't contribute in?
I'm sorry, what was it?
What are the parts we can't contribute in?
What areas you cannot contribute to? Yeah. So the QNX OS itself is not open source. It never was. At some point, there was a license that was for educational, and there were some constraints on that one. I would like to see more of that being published. It probably is not going to be open source for intellectual property issues. There are a number of tools that are in the process of being open source. So we said we were going to open source the Visual Studio plugin, for example. Some of our changes to the IDE are not yet out there, but I would expect at some point things like that are going to go open source. The Cascades itself is not open source. That is because of the patent grant discussion I mentioned to you. We have very strong user interface elements, and right now the industry is in this situation where there are all these lawsuits about user interface patents and stuff like that. So we want to preserve that identity, and that's part of that one. So Cascades at this point is not open source. The Qt layers are all open source, and we're participating directly on. Right. So we have big chunks. As you get closer and closer to the kernel, that's not open source. But for example, our use of libcurl is open source. More questions? So we are doing lunch. I'm going to be at the Experts. You can follow me at Pelegri, or send me email to, oh, I don't have it here, Pelegri-Llopart at rim.com. Actually, tweeting me is more reliable because I get fewer direct messages or messages that way. My inbox is a mess. So normally what I do is I notice the tweets, and then we have a conversation by email. Thank you.